Herodotus lived during the 5th century before the Common Era in ancient Greece. He wrote a narrative summarizing history as it was then known and describing many of the events of his own lifetime. Although direct discussion on his biases and epistemology is saved for the conclusion of the series, on this video you may learn details about a portion of his work. The second book, called Euterpe, Ancient Egypt. Herodotus begins this book by mentioning that Cambyses took power after Cyrus. This new ruler invaded Egypt. Although the whole book deals with the history of Egypt, it is worth noting the name Cambyses as the book ends with a mention of him. The historian describes the famous, or infamous, bit of scientific testing done by one of the earlier pharaohs of Egypt, Psammetichos. He took
2 newborn children belonging to persons of the common sort,
and brought them up,
that no man should utter any word in their presence,
all 4.
Wishing to hear what word the children would let break forth first.
This was supposed to test which race of people first came into existence. Eventually, it was observed of these unfortunate children that they pronounced words similar enough to a word of the Phrygians, and thus it was concluded that those must be the first people that ever came to be. LOL. Regardless, Herodotus credits the Egyptians for being the first to discern the sky and create an effective calendar. He then extensively describes the geography of Egypt and to a lesser extent that of the whole world. This description includes a mention of where, and later in the book how, the stone for the pyramids and many such wonders were gathered and transported. I found this curious given the almost ubiquitous mysticism regarding aliens and the pyramids, given as there is no such stone near their location. Of course, I mean to say ubiquitous among those with more extravagant imaginations. Eventually, after much I will not mention, the historian gets into the much debated question of the Nile. In particular, why does it ebb and grow as it does, and where does it come from? He mentions that there are, or there were in his time, 3 ruling and opposing hypotheses. The first was that the phenomenon of the river rise was due to seasonally changing winds.
The second way shows more ignorance than that which has been mentioned, and it is more marvelous to tell. For it says that the river produces these effects because it flows from the ocean, and that the ocean flows round the whole earth.
I should mention that in a following book the historian references that an Egyptian expedition actually once made it around the whole of Africa. Herodotus continues.
The third of the ways is much the most specious, but nevertheless it is the most mistaken of all. For indeed this way has no more truth in it than the rest, alleging as it does that the Nile flows from melting snow.
The historian provides various reasons why there could not be such snow below the Sahara, from where the Nile must originate. Rather, he provides a hypothesis of his own, a 4th hypothesis.
The sun, being driven away from his former path through the heaven by the stormy winds, comes to the upper parts of Libya.
To make a long story short, somehow, in various ways, he argues that the position of the sun must alter the amount of water in the Nile. For your information, the historian refers to Africa as Libya, and Upper Nile means Southern Nile. The latter segues into a mention of the Ethiopians. Though there are several mentions of them, at first Herodotus tells a story wherein many Egyptian warriors revolted from Psammetichos and settled in Ethiopia. Jocularly enough to quote, as the pharaoh pleaded with them not to leave.
One of them pointed to his privy member and said that wherever this was, there they would have both children and wives.
The writer credits these men for pacifying, culturing the Ethiopians. He says nothing is certain of below Ethiopia, but he tells a story of a report about some very small, black-skinned kind of men. As if they were weird creatures from the edges of the map. LOL. The topic returns to discussing Egypt and begins by saying,
it has wonders more in number than any other land.
Yet, he saves such things for later. The reference seems to be but a suspense builder. Rather, he first talks about the Egyptians' manner and habits. Of these there are many, from the women, allegedly, peeing standing up while the men pee sitting down to the practice of male circumcision. I found the latter most curious, and there are several references to it. A later historian, Diodorus Siculus' Library of History, will explain the Egyptian mythology that led to this practice. Herodotus merely explores the spread of the practice, which apparently was inherited by all around Egypt. He says that the only in Libya, Africa, who do not do it because they learned from the Greeks not to do it. Among these he names the Carthaginians. I guess, therefore, the Jewish faith inherited the practice from the ancient Egyptians. There is no mention of the Jews, but other historians, such as Polybius, which you may also learn about on this channel, do mention them. Similarly, the Egyptians' curious eating habits are described. The cow was not eaten, it was considered sacred. I guess as modern-day Hindus. It is the same with goats since the deity Pan was most sacred to them. The latter parallels with a recurring discussion of the gods. These are identified as the same as the Greco-Roman, though with different names and physical representations. Of course, the Egyptian version of Zeus has the head of a ram, for example. Nonetheless, Herodotus says it is Zeus. Funny enough, to the historians' disappointment, they do not have Poseidon or Castor and Pollux. But they do have Heracles, they have him a lot. They in fact consider Heracles one of the main 8. As Herodotus explains, they divide the gods into 8 primaries, 12 secondaries, and all the rest are a third group. By the way, the pig was not so lucky among them. It was considered a most dirty animal. There are many mentions of the Egyptians' religious practices. Among them is a description of a ceremony in honor to none other than Ares, the god of war, in which the participants would strike each other with wooden planks. Let me skip over these things and merely say that the historian repeatedly makes the argument that the Greeks learned about the deities from such barbarians, principally from the Egyptians. Actually, no discourse of the Egyptian culture and their animals is complete without a mention of cats, of felines. Surprisingly, the writer says they frequently kill recently born cats. They do so as the female does not bear living with a male under the same roof after she has given birth to kitties. Nonetheless, when a cat dies, all in the household tend to shave their eyelashes. This must have been funny as he credits them as the only people to shave not only their beard, but also their head, even women. They did have dogs, but they buried these in the house, while cats had special, out of the home, sacred tombs. Let me not skip as much as previously insinuated, as there are many remarkable descriptions, including mentions of the famous crocodile. Let me quote,
"Of all the mortal creatures of which we have knowledge, this grows to the greatest bulk from the smallest beginning. Unlike all other beasts, he grows no tongue, neither does he move his lower jaw, but brings the upper jaw towards the lower, being in this too unlike all other beasts."
Although much more is said, to be brief, know that according to Herodotus, in some areas, the Egyptians love these mysterious beasts, and they even tame them. Oh my Zeus! I would love a crocodile pet. Returning to human practices, the Egyptians are credited as the most developed in the art of medicine. This segues into the practices of mummifying. Apparently, there were 3 economic tiers of such things. Jocular enough, he mentions that beautiful or young women's corpses are not given to embalmers until at least 3 days after they have died. I quote,
"The embalmers may not abuse their women, for they say that one of them was taken once doing so to the corpse of a woman lately dead, and his fellow craftsmen gave information."
Truly, deprivation has no borders or time period. Finally, Herodotus gets to the history of Egypt, not yet a description of their wonders. He first describes how the alleged first pharaoh, ever, ordered a terraforming of the Nile. It is hard to understand what exactly the work consisted of, how it changed the course of the Nile, but apparently the Persians still maintain the work by the time of Herodotus. Know that other ancient historians describe these things in greater detail. Several pharaohs later, a certain Sesostris engaged into a so-called exploratory conquest. Apparently, this king not only subdued Arabia, but also much of the Middle East and even the Scythians, which I reckon is meant to describe a general area in the modern steppes of Russia and Ukraine. All along the way, this man left markers which still stand, at Herodotus's times, as proof of how far he made it. This very man, after returning from his military exploration, partitioned ownership of Egypt's land and in the process established their tax system and perhaps invented geometry. Meaning, as the areas of land and taxes had to be measured and assessed, geometry and mathematics were needed. Perhaps not so much to further laud Sesostris, but rather to psychologize, mockingly, Darius, a future Persian emperor. The historian has it that when the latter wished to build a statue besides that of Sesostris, this was objected to and forbidden by the priests of Egypt. They told the Persian that he himself had not yet done anything like the ancient pharaoh. The historian says that Darius might have taken this reproach to heart. Subsequently arrives the rule of Proteus, the same in Euripides' play titled Helen. In fact, it is from this historian that the playwright famously got the plot for that partially lost trilogy. By the way, know that on this channel you may also learn about Euripides' plays. The historian says that he inquired about the veracity of the Trojan legend as he found a temple in the shores of Egypt dedicated to foreign Aphrodite. He was told that they also had heard of the Trojan War, and it was there, on that Egyptian shore, that Menelaus had found Helen. Herodotus supposes that Homer had heard of this possibility. To be clear, it is that Paris unwillingly arrived there after fleeing with Helen. As such, Proteus forbid him from taking the wife of another. Instead, Paris had returned to Troy without Helen, which is why the Trojans could not return her. After all, it is only logical that Priam or Hector would have returned her if they had her. Instead, the whole war must have been fought because the Argives, Menelaus, and Agamemnon refused to believe that she was not in Troy. Either way, this is not exactly as Euripides later dramatizes it. As for Homer's version, the historian points out that the poet has it that Hector and Helen were lost at sea for a while before reaching Troy. Ergo, maybe Homer had heard about this possibility. By the way, you may also learn about Homer's epic on this channel. As to why the gods would contribute or allow such seemingly pointless war, the historian says that it must have been so as to
make it evident to men that for great wrongs great also are the chastisements which come from the gods.
A harrowing thought. After Proteus, there comes Rhampsinitos. This involves a most jocular story. It was a popular story of a rascal that frequently tricked or outwitted the pharaoh. This man was the child of the engineer that built a treasury for the king. A treasury that the king filled with gold and silver. Though the building was otherwise safe, the engineer built a secret loose stone, one that could be moved by his sons to steal the money. Thus, after their father died, the sons started stealing. To make a long story short, the two brothers repeatedly steal from the safe until one of them is caught in a trap and the other is forced to cut off his brother's head. The mother then
threatened that she would and give information to the king that he had the money
if he, the survivor, did not recover the body of the dead brother that was hung humiliatingly and impiously. The survivor devises a way to recover the body. This involved getting the guards drunk. Afterwards, though Herodotus does not believe this part of the story, the pharaoh puts his own daughter to engage in prostitution for the purpose of having her inquire which of her subsequent many clients might be the thief. She does that very thing. He jocularly reveals himself but manages to flee, eventually.
Rhampsinitos greatly marveled at him and gave him this daughter of his to wife, counting him to be the most knowing of all men.
Of course, this must be, at least in part, a popular, entertaining legend. There's a brief mention on how the Egyptians believed in reincarnation, and that it is from here certain Hellenes that Herodotus purposely abstains from explicitly mentioning must have gotten the idea. I wonder, who does he not reference? Is it the Pythagoreans? They believed in reincarnation. Either way, I guess such a notion must have been considered impious. The next pharaoh mentioned is a certain Cheops. He is attributed for bringing every kind of evil.
He shut up all the temples, and having first kept them from sacrificing there, he then bade all the Egyptians work for him.
It is he, I reckon, who builds the largest of the famous pyramids. The whole process and engineering marvel is described. This pharaoh is so odiously remembered that it is said of him that he set his own daughter to prostitution and made every client contribute a stone for the pyramid. The next king, Mykerinos, the son of the prior, is remembered well as he revoked his father's evil and returned things to how they previously were. At some subsequent point, Egypt had a blind pharaoh under whose rule the country was conquered by the Ethiopians. These ruled for 50 years until their leader, apparently merely due to an ominous vision, willingly left the country. Then came into power a former priest named Sehos. This one did not get along with the warrior class. Thus, when the Assyrians invaded, the king had to arm the civilians, the shopkeepers and artisans, as the warriors refused to fight. Yet, the night before the battle, in a miracle, a swarm of little mice ate or damaged all of the Assyrians' bows and shields. Thus, the invaders fled and Sehos was victorious by the grace of divinity. The historian says,
And at the present time this king stands in the temple of Hephaestos in stone, holding upon his hand a mouse, and by letters inscribed he says these words,
Let him who looks upon me learn to fear the gods.
Of course, Herodotus loves this. By the way, Hephaestos was one of the principal gods of the Egyptians. I reckon this would be Phat, the god of artisans, engineers, and smith workers. Either way, the historian then makes the following curious remark.
Being set free after the reign of the priest of Hephaestos, the Egyptians, since they could not live any time without a king, set up over them 12 kings, having divided all Egypt into 12 parts.
What I find curious is the mention that they could not live without a king. This fact lies forgotten. To the civilized, monarchies are for barbarians. They need them, for they cannot be autonomous. Either way, these 12 tried to be friends and at peace. Of course, this does not last. There was a prophecy that whoever drank from a bronze cup during a specific yearly gathering or ceremony would be king of all. It happened that one of them, for he was lacking a cup, drank from his helmet, which incidentally was made of bronze. Thus, upon realizing, the other 11 exiled him. Yet this man, feeling unjustly treated, managed to rally certain Ionian and Carian pirates, and beginning with them as mercenaries, he conquered the whole of Egypt. His name was Psammetichos. Herodotus now describes the economy of Egypt. He says the whole society was divided into 7 classes, each for a general profession. All such status was hereditary and fixed. Of the 7 classes, the warriors are held in the highest repute, while the craftsmen are at the lowest. The historian finds it curious how this valuation repeats from society to society. He says that
the Hellenes have all learnt this, and especially the Lacedaemonians. But the Corinthians least of all cast slight upon those who practice handicrafts.
It must be recognized that the prior is an implied criticism or mockery of Sparta. It is as if in this respect they are the most barbarians. Also, Corinth's culture still benefited from Periander's rule. Remember, he was the wise king that defended the lower classes. Likewise, at this time Athens was at least growing to more value craftsmen. That is about it all. Bringing the narrative full circle, the historian repeats that the then ruler of Persia, Cambyses, will invade Egypt and defeat the then pharaoh, a man named Osiris. In the following books, Herodotus describes things such as the insane Persian king that conquered Egypt, the fights between the 2 Spartan kings, how Athens became a democracy, and, of course, how the allied Greek cities survived the Persian invasion. Make sure you don't miss it. Now, to pique your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
It seems that Zeus most often strikes the prideful, but this is because the prideful enjoy boasting about how they were struck, and the envious enjoy hearing about how the prideful were struck.
If you enjoy or gain from my aphorisms, know that I have thousands. I will be writing books with short thematic essays composed out of aphorisms. These essays are profound and intriguing yet easy to read. For very cheap copies, look up Protagoras Pause in the Amazon website. I repeat, Protagoras Pause, that's my name.